Beyin her şeyi açık.
Can brain explain everything? Who says that it can explain everything? Please raise your hands. İsmet. Why do you think like that? Any other opinion? Anyone thinking differently? I want to answer my professor. It doesn't explain that it is explaining. It just shows that it's inside the brain. Yes. Today, Professor Kazım, and in parallel with what he said, I will be making a presentation. And some thoughts are overlapping because we used similar resources. Brain can explain everything, and mind can be reduced down to brain, to neurons. There is one approach, and there is another approach which states that brain, just like our legs, is a part, an organ. It's a complex organ, it's a complicated organ, so we do not say that our legs are walking, and we cannot say that our brain is thinking. We think with our brains, but our brains do not think. So this is, I'm going to try to do that. Reducing down to parts, pieces, is an approach that is used very frequently. The complex one is reduced down to a simple one, and by examining the simple one, we try to get an idea about the whole. However, in cells, it's different in skin, it's different in brain, and there is a molecule, deceased molecule behind each and every deceased pattern. We have to think of it. So mental processes cannot be there without a functional brain. It's not that we are thinking due to neurons, but it's because of the outer stimulus that neurons are activated and do something. Mind cannot be can be explained on the level of brain, but there are some alternatives which I will be speaking of. Autopoiesis. I'd like to draw your attention to autopoiesis. Each and every living mechanism is a process, and everything flows and is an entity that is flowing to something else. Reducing down means that if you understand something, you want to understand something, look closer. If there is smoke, you should look closer to see what it is. And if something is broken, you can look at the parts to identify what's happening. In the last 10 years, biological degradation fails to explain everything. Genetic complexity is too much. So it's just like it reached to a blind point. For mental diseases, there is no single genetic variation. So today, we speak of translational studies, basic biochemical and imaging studies, how they can be translated into clinics. There are important, these efforts are very important because it's not only the genes or biochemistry that explains it, but social changes should be taken into consideration and there as a part of the equation. And for brain plasticity, there is an increased awareness, which I will be explaining shortly. So in the field, especially young colleagues who are interested in the field, there is an article that I am recommending. So the article is about interpersonal relations, meanings, and values are all within our area of interest. Patient may come to you with existential problems. You may not see always biochemical abnormalities, but sometimes values, meanings, and personal relations may become very important in the psychiatric office. So, psychiatry is not only about neurochemical changes, but it should be considered together with the context, economic, political, and social context should be taken on board in psychiatry. There may be false, it may not be presented with false psychology. So causality with physiology will bring about medicalization of daily life. Medicalization means medicalizing the social processes. For instance, in Argentina, during economic crisis, there was a very intensive prescription of antidepressants by the doctors. So unhappiness of people was defined by medical terms, which means missing the real causes of it. Lawrence Kiermaier said that to identify psychiatry as a neuroscience will make the brain superior. Today, psychotherapy, these images are catching our attention. So colored imaging, brain images are convincing for us, and nearly everywhere what does neuroscience do? First, it makes brain more visible. Specific symptoms, diseases, and disorders, it provided a partial explanation, and the responsibility rests on the family. And on the other hand, it was overly inflated because they thought that it may contribute to the drug industry. The problem is not in the social area, but in our brain and in our body is another perception. So, when I started my residency in psychiatrics, there was a controversial article, Louis Eisenberg, published in British Journal of Medicine. Psychiatry, is it without mind or without brain? As mentioned by Kazım, psychiatry without a brain for until 20 or 30 years ago, mind was at the forefront and biological parameters were not considered. Okay, in such a case, what should we choose? Should we choose to be the ones without a brain or mind? So the life events may change brain, and the brain may change with some other factors.
Yenileyen sistem son 10-20 yıldır yine çok.
It's a system
system renewing itself and discussed widely in the last 2 decades, not just neuroplasticity, but self-organizing features of the brain. Self-organizing itself and reorganizing, reconnecting within its own structure, such a complex and magnificent system. This is what we have learned. So, brain can reoccur at any moment. It can add new features in an unexpected way. That is why I call it unexpected, the brain. So, brand new features may be added to the brain structure at any moment, which shows brain isn't static but in interaction with the environment. It adapts to the social environment. This is what we understand. So, for fMRI, I think we shouldn't have lots of judgments about it. So, by just brain imaging techniques, we shouldn't turn our patients into victims. This is what we should be avoiding actually as psychiatrists. Of course, these brain images help us understand a lot, but this doesn't mean that region is the center of mental activity. So, I believe that we should consider the brain as a handloom and how those endless connections occur at the cortex. We do not have clear information about it. Brain imaging techniques, what do they provide for us? What does neuroscience provide for us? Of course, neuroscience is very important and useful, but I call it the reductionist, minimalist neuroscience. There's a gap between the abstract mind and abstract brain, and we can bridge this gap. But the methods used here are extrapolation, deductions, and the fact that the idea that seeing means and resolves everything. Complex systems cannot always be reduced down to single units to understand them. And about biologism, whether the nature or the environment is most effective. So are we under more influence of the environment or our genetic inherited brain? This is a discussion that is ongoing, a hot debate. In sunset, psychiatrists should be called clinical neuroscientists. In a world of values and meanings, in a world in which human is a producer of meaning and value, it is very important that we shouldn't have such a materialistic point of view. Some say the brain is equal to the mind, but Eric Kandel says brain plus free will is equal to mind. And there are other different opinions in this field as well. In every age, there's a persistent or prevailing physical mechanism. During the age of Freud, actually, there are always concepts of suppression and arousal, So if you suppress something, it will come back in from a different path. So in our age, the information age, we use the concepts input, output based on the age of computerization that we are living in. How many minutes do I have left? I think I need to skip some of my slides. Okay. Psychiatry, if we regard it as an applied neuroscience, do we then do not take into consideration maybe insight or maybe clinical foresight? We had actually one very important professor that we invited this year, Fox, but he wasn't able to make it this year. I hope he will come next year. So psychiatry should be regarded as a associative branch of science or branch of medicine, a relational medicinal branch. And biological psychiatry was a term that was popular in some period in the past, but now they say bio model for human interactions and social environment. They say we shouldn't take it into account. So this is such a reductionist approach that these other things other than biology do not matter. And what does neuromania mean? It is about the neuroeconomy, neuroethics, neurotheology. So they think that brain imaging techniques can help us explain everything, and they use the prefix neuro for almost everything. Like it's like a type of secular spiritualism, mysticism added to New Ageism industry, and which is very popular actually. So it is also attractive for the personal development industry as well. And particularly recently, in parallel to psychiatric atmosphere, addictions, they try to explain addictions by just based on dopamine in the brain. And John Galton, some authors, for example, depend on phrenology. They think it's like phrenology. He defined human characteristics based on some points on the head, but it was found to be a nonsense then. So some say you are your brain, and if we can understand the brain sufficiently, then we can treat all psychiatric diseases. So, but the brain is very complex, so a neuronal level explanation will not be possible. And there are some explanations that when the subjects see their beloved ones, then the X area of their brain is activated. But I think it's a very superficial type of statement. fMRI was mentioned by the previous speaker. I will skip the technical aspects as well. About fMRI, there are many criticisms, both from the technical and methodological point of view, but it's still very popular. Why? Because medical biological explanations are always thought to be more important. So let me show you an example of this. This is Your Brain on Politics, is the name of the op-ed, and it's a brain imaging technique which was used for politicians, and they say political attitudes vary with psychological traits and vascularization in the brain. So, of course, it is encouraging for us, but should we depend on it to explain everything? This is the question we should be asking ourselves. And these things that we do not know very well, maybe technology can help us explain them better. And if it's still not possible, which is our case, should we still keep defending it? Ecology of the Brain is the name of Fox, is the book of Fox, which has been published recently. About psychiatric diseases, I think there are three important terms: reductionism, reification, which means mental states can be localized in the brain. So a mental disorder will be equal to an excessively high circuit activation, reduced metabolic activity, or dysfunction in one part of the brain. And the third term is isolating the individual from his or her environment. So let's start with reductionism. What happened in this field? They spent all those efforts and worked very hard, but the neurobiological reductionism didn't work very well in psychiatry. And there was a high expectation for success, but it was a major disappointment in the treatment of schizophrenia and depression. They thought there would be a breakthrough, but it didn't happen. Still, about the neurobiology of depression, we are struggling with lots of hypotheses. So they allocated lots of resources, but it didn't make a breakthrough in our field. To give an example, subjects who were in love were put under fMRI, and depending on the blood flow, they tried to understand the neurophysiological changes that occur in the brain. But romantic love is very complex. There are emotions involved, intentions involved, and when you go to buy flowers for your beloved, then you are engaging in a motor activity, and you have monologues inside your head, and you have some imaginary conversations that you have with your lover. So some will be more in some people and some will be less. So expecting a consistent blood flow in the same parts of the brain when you put a person in love in fMRI is, I think, not possible. The relationship between object and brain cannot be explained in a very detailed way by neuroscience. Of course, when you scan the brain, you can reach a correlation, but correlation doesn't mean causality, cause and result relationship. And it is necessary, of course, but not sufficient. This is, I think, an important phrase: necessary but not sufficient. So I need my brain, of course, but it's not sufficient. It's not always the brain that you need for everything. Another important and interesting article, Voodoo Correlations is the name of this article in fMRI. Puzzlingly high correlations in fMRI studies of emotion, personality, and social. So they claim that with brain scanning, the relations between behaviors and emotions are being exaggerated, and these lead to statistical errors. It's my new mobile actually, and I couldn't put it in silence mode. I'm sorry for that. Thomas Insel says something very interesting. He says he spent 13 years at NIMH and spent almost $20 billion on neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders, but they still haven't succeeded at getting anything real or important, and he holds himself accountable for that because he is one of the pioneers of the neuroscience age. And RDoC criteria were mentioned by the previous speaker. For RDoC, there's such a criticism. They call it psychiatry without psych. And the RDoC criteria actually aim to bring together neuroclinical findings and neurobiological findings and the clinic, but there wasn't much of a progress. It didn't achieve a lot. And there are some critical books and texts. Brainwashed is one of those books. The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. I think I have too many slides, so I have to skip many of them and come to the conclusion of my presentation. Brain imaging can give us ideas about lots of things. However, it wouldn't tell us whether that person is a liar or he is an admirer, fan of a brand or not, or whether he or she is forced to use cocaine or not, and the data that we have from brain imaging doesn't add anything to the traditional methods that we're currently using, and it can give us a fake causality actually. So the brain mind makes the person active, but neuroscience is far from explaining how this occurs. We need to ask the right questions about neuroscience. For example, while making an ethical decision, which neural processes play a role? It can give us an idea to answer this question. However, this information cannot help us answer what is right or how some things should be. And in the past, biology was used during the Nazi period. It was used for some bloody type of activities, and excessive biology can always be abused, and we need to be careful about this. If we consider addiction as a disorder of the brain, actually maybe it is more simple, but it has lots of other dimensions and we need to consider them as well. It is the same for psychopathy. The information provided by neuroscience should be refined, and we shouldn't expect it to explain the nature of humans as a whole. There's a saying of Nemia: us psychotherapists voice the depth of our patients' existence and vibrate with their emotions. We are like musical instruments working with our patients, and we are ourselves. And for some, we are nothing but our brain. Of course, without the brain, we cannot speak about the conscience, but still you and me, we are all selves, and we all have a capacity to make decisions and examine how these decisions occur, and also to weigh the responsibilities and freedoms that these decisions provide for us. So we have a sense of justice, we have a sense of solidarity, we have sensitivities of our own, and all of these actually cannot be reduced down to our brain. It's just not just our brain involved. Thank you very much for your attention.